Good afternoon, everybody. What a lovely way of spending a Tuesday lunchtime. It's so lovely to see you all. This picture of me was taken about 15 years ago, but I still roll it out for obvious reasons. My name is Nina Nanar. I'm the arts editor of ITV News, and it's a real joy to welcome you here to the RSA Great Room for what we hope will be a very scintillating, fascinating event this afternoon. We have people joining us online today. Hello, from all over the world. No pressure, George, but hello, that's my family in Canada. And George's mum. Do you have family watching?
I don't know if they will have worked out how to do that. My gran definitely won't.
Absolutely fine. Now, this event is one of a special series to mark the RSA's 270th anniversary, and all the events in this section have been united by a theme, and that theme is courage. And I can think a few other people better qualified really to talk about this than George, not just in the courage and resilience of the people who are your subjects, if I can call them that, the people that you illustrate, their resilience and their courage, but also your courage as well, because you go into places that are very difficult, devastating situation, and you sit quietly and you take your time and you do these unique testimonies. George Butler, as you all perhaps will know, is an acclaimed award-winning reportage illustrator. Over the last 15 years, George has travelled widely: Afghanistan, Syria, Turkey, Ukraine. And he creates these astonishing illustrations, those of you who've seen George's works. And the key thing is he creates them in situ. So he sits there in the middle of his subjects, he takes his time and he draws them. And he's often in some of the most difficult circumstances in the world, where there's humanitarian and climate change crises going on, war zones, natural disaster situations. And in the middle of them, you can find this extraordinary artist sitting and capturing something in a world where we are used to having images thrust at us very quickly and then disappearing in a 24-hour news world. And you've got your pen and you've got your paper, and he sits there and he does things in a unique, quiet, perhaps more reflective way than most of us will be used to when we see images of what's going on in the world. And in this very digital age, what you offer is something very, very unique, and that's why you're at the forefront of your field. Now, I have had the opportunity of meeting George, I think it was exactly a year ago, and George had just returned from Ukraine. So it's a real honour for me to be here, because when I met George and I interviewed him for News at 10, what we spoke about was this upcoming book. And here the book is, Ukraine, Remember Also Me, which is an astonishing collection of stories and illustrations from George's time there. So we'll get onto that shortly. But just before we dive in, we would love to hear from you after we've had our chat. So if you've got any questions that arise, there will be time for the questions. And that also applies to the people who are joining us online. If you're watching online, you can drop your questions in the YouTube chat or on social media using the hashtag RSA Courage. So, George, let's get started. It's lovely to see you. It is about a year ago, isn't it, when we first encountered each other?
It was, yeah. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming and listening. Yeah, I think it was. I was last in Ukraine in March 2023. So, and since then, it's just been putting together the interviews and some of the drawings for the book.
And a very hard selection it must have been, because everyone's got a story over in Ukraine at the moment.
Everyone's got a story, and I think initially I thought that I was doing some great kind of journalistic work to be seeking out these stories all over the country. And the more people I spoke to, the more I realised that if you're living in Ukraine at the moment, or even if you're living outside it, there isn't a single person without one of these stories that we can relate to. And sometimes more difficult to get them to tell them because they think they've got more important things to do, which they do, or they're too shy, or they don't believe that telling the news will help. But there's 25 stories in here in their own words, which I think is important. And yeah, let's talk about a few of them.
There's something in the way you deliver their stories and their illustrations, which I would imagine makes it very comfortable for them. I mean, let's start on this first image here. Can you tell us a bit about who we're looking at there, George?
But also it makes it very comfortable for me as well.
Yes.
I think there's this sort of intimacy where they're trying to make me feel comfortable about their sometimes very difficult situation. And that was definitely the case in the case of Madame Olga, who I met in Kyiv in 2022. I was taken to her house by some volunteers who were delivering aid to older people who didn't want to leave their homes. And that's a very regular story. That generation, I mean, she's 99, had lived for the entirety of the Soviet Union. So they were very familiar with their old sort of bigger brothers in Russia and how they behaved. And they wanted to live in their houses despite the continuing bombardment. And Madame Olga was too frail to get out of bed on the 4th floor of her apartment block. So when the air raid siren went off, speaking of brave, she just lay in bed and hoped that nothing would hit her house. And when we first went there, it was me and a friend called Oliver Marsden. He was making a bit of film. She thought that we were there to take her away from her home, so she was very nervous.
So she wouldn't probably let you in?
No, she was just very, you could see she's very agitated. And her daughter, who was called Valentina, I think she was 79, and we were trying to reassure her that it was all okay. And eventually she says, this is in the book, she says, "If you all be quiet, I'll tell you the story from the beginning." And she spoke very slowly, she was very forthright, but her voice was very frail. And she had been born in 1923. She had survived the Holodomor with her family, the great famine that killed so many Ukrainians. Her father, she was taken to a collective farm with her father. You know, these are all things we've heard about in history, in the history books. And then the war started. She was taken as a sort of slave or a servant to work in Dresden for a Nazi family. She talks about how she was fed worms, and eventually the Soviet army came to liberate that part of Dresden. And she was asked to walk 130 cows back to Ukraine. And on the way back, she meets her husband Petro, and they stay together. And she lives another 80 years. She has 4 children. Her great-granddaughter is living in Berlin. And it was this sort of story that sort of set up the book, the history of Ukraine and the Soviet Union, and then like bringing us right up to date with what's happening there at the moment.
So, as Olga spoke, you were drawing. Is that how it works?
I was drawing her, yeah.
Yeah. And she knew you were drawing it. Did she want to have a look at it at the end? I mean, how does it work? So Mila, the volunteer, her eyesight was so poor, and her hearing was also so poor that they sort of sat right in front of her, holding her hands and just talking directly to her. So she was very aware that we were there, but I think she wasn't that interested in seeing what I'd done, and I also felt a bit sort of sheepish showing her. But yeah, I remember she was a tiny sort of body under her duvet cover. She had a Bible tucked under her pillow, and I suppose all the more poignantly, she very sadly died of old age a few months later. So this, in a way, was as a record of that life, which we would have otherwise never have known. That's really lovely. I know capturing history is very important to you and keeping these testimonies alive. It sounds like she was ready to tell her story to me. So let's take a look at another image. Okay. So we are well aware, having seen the news imagery and photographs from newspapers of the war zone in Ukraine. So your take on it, of course, is different. So tell us what we're looking at here.
I think that, well, this is we were allowed, I always say we because there's always somebody else in the car, like a translator or a fixer, or usually you're only ever really as good as well, in this case, is the Ukrainians that you're with, and we were allowed to visit a facility that they described as a secret facility in Kharkiv, where these it was all covered. You weren't allowed to come in by different cars in case it looked too busy. They all finished work at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, so there were no lights that might be a target for Russian bombardment. And in these enormous warehouses, they fixed tanks from the front line. Sometimes Russian, you can see with the Z on there, sometimes Ukrainian. Obviously, their greatest joy was to deliver a Russian tank back to the front line to fight against the Russians. And then the yellow bits painted on the turrets are so that they recognize, the infantry recognize which side they're on. That's also very something that we thought was probably committed to the history books, people running around with the same uniforms on, but with armbands so that they could distinguish. So in some cases, it's a very modern war in that there's lots of drones and we're reliant on huge aid on one side, but and in the other case, it's very, I guess it reminds us of all the things we knew about the Second World War, trench warfare, and enormous, like the entire country pulling together to try and sort of push back against this invasion. And I think the version you're talking about is a deliberately slow version of the news.
So when you say deliberately slow, how long will you have been in the presence of those tanks and the people?
I think, because it's so difficult to get access, I think I was probably there for an afternoon and made a couple of drawings. I obviously am always drawn to, I think as artists, you're always drawn to the thing that you think you can make look good. So the mechanics of things and lots of white space and busy, dirty, sort of inky scenes are what I really enjoy drawing. And then I find the people much more difficult, but I realized I'm just going to keep flicking. I realized in drawing, making this book, that actually the stories of the Ukrainians, in a way, are more poignant and perhaps more important than the drawings themselves. The drawings are a kind of handshake into that world, but it's their stories.
I love this one. You were allowed into this space. It's obviously a very small, cramped space, and looking at the expressions of those soldiers, it's weary. It's as if they don't even know you're there, or they certainly don't mind, or they're ignoring you. I don't quite know what the narrative is there.
So this was a artillery unit near Kupiansk. They're about 6 kilometers from the front line, and I went with a Ukrainian girl called Zvinka, who was helping me translate, and we went with a volunteer. There's this enormous volunteer network across Ukraine. He had taken these 6 lads on as his sort of his project. He took their laundry backwards and forwards. He took them sweets. He bought them cigarettes. Anything to help them sort of survive life living underground. They dug a hole, they put tree trunks on top of it, they covered it in earth to try and survive the artillery attack from the Russian side. And we got there, we turned our phones off, we walked through this field of dead sunflowers, and we eventually arrived at this sort of hole in the ground. They'd been shelled that morning, and they were high on adrenaline. Their eyes were enormously wide, buzzing around. It was exciting to have a foreigner there. It was exciting to have a girl there. And eventually we got them to calm down and sit still. And Andre and Alexander told me their stories for the book. And it was, I sort of arrived and said, how long have I got? And every time I said a time, they just laughed. And eventually I think we stayed for about, actually we probably would have stayed for much longer, an hour or so. But one of the drawings outside that we did really wasn't safe to be out there. And it'll come up in a minute, but I asked how long have we got? And they said, well, we shelled this morning, so this is this is the most dangerous moment. And I said, okay, well, I'll be 5 minutes, why don't you go inside? And they were like, no, we'll wait with you. Oh. And so then I sort of put an end to it because I couldn't face the pressure of people waiting around whilst I was doing something which is not that important compared to them. But there's that balance, I think, always in sort of risk versus capturing a story.
So people like that, they'll be well used to people coming along saying, can I take a picture, or simply someone taking a picture. So what you're offering is a much slower and completely different process that not many people will be familiar with. Some people might vaguely know that in the Victorian era there were war artists and stuff, but you're continuing a tradition that people perhaps don't know is still, you know, going strong today. How do you tell these battle-weary soldiers, I'm going to draw you, I'm going to sketch you, and you're sitting in the middle of a war zone?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Well, in this case, and in some cases, especially the military areas in Ukraine, they're very nervous about people taking photographs for all the right reasons. There's this real paranoia. There was a story on the way to this village that someone in the village had given away their position. So they were actually fine with the idea of drawing. Normally, what happens is that it's something that people don't take very seriously. They like telling their story because people do like telling their stories, but also it's kind of unthreatening. They can see what they're doing. They don't think they're necessarily recognizable. Perhaps they won't be seen on social media. So there's a sort of, it can put people at ease. And then after that, it is a bit like doing a magic trick. As long as you don't muck it up or offend them along the way, there is this sort of illusion that appears on the page. And by the end of this, Andre, the guy closest to us, he'd shared his story about his cousin and how he'd been a veteran in the war, even though he was only 28. And he ripped the badges off his sleeves and sort of thrust them at me and held me by both shoulders and hugged me and kind of kissed me on both cheeks. And I just sort of think that was him saying, you know, don't forget us.
Can I just ask this, that there's some numbers written across the bottom of the
Yes, we should call them, yeah.
Is that the phone numbers?
Yeah, I should have rubbed them out, but that is just to give you a sense of that connection. They then wanted to write their names on there, and I'm in touch with them. I'm in touch with lots of people in the book.
Are you?
On whichever social media platform they're on.
That's amazing. Now, they certainly will have wanted to see what you...
Yes, they've seen it, yeah. The guy on the right, he's got a good story. He was a volunteer, and it was his job to clear the Feldman Zoo in northern Kharkiv before it was struck by artillery. And so he went along. I think it had already been hit, and he went along and he had to sedate this wolf, and then he had to put the wolf in the back of his car, and he had to drive it the whole way across Ukraine to Dnipro. And at every checkpoint he got to, they said, can you open the boot? And he said, no, I can't. And they said, please, can you open the boot? And he said, no, I've got a wolf in the back. And they'd say, of course you have it. And then they'd open the boot, and there's this enormous animal. And he told it in a very funny way that eventually he'd get to the zoo. And after that, he then joined the army. And the saddest thing he said about the zoo was that the monkeys screamed like humans when the missiles came in. It's just this enormous, soft, gentle men that were going around before have now found themselves drinking high energy fizzy drinks and smoking cigarettes to get through.
Okay, let's
we can
take a look at that. Okay.
I mean, they get sadder and sadder.
Okay.
The book is actually supposed to be more positive than...
Okay. That's the thing. I mean, the testimonies of the people that are in the book that accompany the illustrations, almost all of them say at the end, we're going to win. And there's an element of hope in pretty much all of the stories that your subjects are telling there. And it is like, oh, yeah, we're going to win, we're going to win, we're going to win. It's going to be over soon. I mean, sadly, it's still continuing. But there is hope in the book. There is.
Yeah. I think, worth remembering that all of these stories, although I was there for a couple of days or an hour in some cases with each of them, their stories continue at the moment on the front line. And
this must have been very difficult to do.
Yeah. So I think that, just to go back to I think that in the first year, when there was this sort of moment where the Russians were being pushed back, there was a great sort of identity, community, and sense of winning in Ukraine, and the public-facing thing is we're going to win and we're going to take back everything. But a year later, and I suspect that is more true than ever now, there's a real kind of concern about how it's going to end, and that perhaps the rest of the world doesn't care as much as they thought they did, and will the aid arrive from America? And it's really difficult. So this scene was typical. I think we would all remember it. It was that time where we realized in Bucha that all the stories that the Ukrainians had been telling about the Russians were in fact true. And I arrived here by chance, actually. We came to visit the church on the day that they were exhuming the bodies from a mass grave. And on one side, they sort of put up some fairly rudimentary barriers for the press, and on the other side, that sort of dark mass of people were the residents waiting to see if any of the people that came out of the grave were related to them, if there was any news of people who'd gone missing a few weeks before. So it was highly emotional, kind of vulnerable moment, which, in a way, everybody wanted they wanted everybody there for the world to see, but also it was so personal, and these body bags were being slowly laid out on the ground in front of the church, and to my mind, very obviously, civilians coming out of the ground, old men with grey beards, some with blindfolds on, and that was, I guess, if nothing else, it was a record of that moment.
If you're a photographer at that scene, you can photograph it and then move on pretty quickly and send your imagery in this digital world. I mean, the nature of what you do means you can't do that. You've got to be in situ for as long as it takes to capture everything in there. So I don't know. That must be really tough.
I think in a way, it's difficult because you have to sit and watch. And in a way, I think the drawing is a way of comprehending what's in front of you, and it feels like it makes it safe to look at again. I think the photographs, loads of photographs of this exact scene from the same place. I was standing alongside photographers, and they're all on the news. You probably saw them all already. Yeah. In a way, I feel it's nice to be able to share it and sort of halve it with everybody else who's looking at it. But certainly the stories of everyone in the book, I think I don't feel traumatized by them. I feel like they're somebody else's trauma, but I don't think they ever leave. I don't think they ever leave me, as it were. I think once you've drawn it out like that, it sort of stays in you.
What do you think you offer through a drawing of that we won't have seen in those photographs that appeared in our papers and on the news and stuff?
I think that illustration is. I think the process just allows you to be there without being a voyeur. I think the people give you sort of. You're there with the permission of the people who are in the subject, because you have to be there for so long, and they can always walk away if they don't want to be there. So there's this sort of informal introduction to it, and it's unthreatening, and people can see over your shoulder, and they probably think it's quite funny, or they might just, certainly to start with, and there's a sort of composite image that you can piece together, and the white space allows people to superimpose what they know of that moment. It's not polarizing. There aren't extremes there.
I wonder if people trust you more because you are there longer. There must be an element of that going on. I know when I go out to interview people, I have to spend more time around the actual 15-minute interview I do with someone. I spend much more time around it, getting them to settle down with me, to know me, to like me, and then I know that we can work together. And I think that must be the case with you.
I think so. I just think that there must be. I think that the way. It's interesting to talk to you about it, but I think that the way that we receive our news and the way that it's collected sometimes doesn't portray the kind of humanity that I have seen close to the front line, and that feels like such a kind of betrayal of everybody who's there trying to tell their stories. And I know that we consume it passively, and that it flicks past on our phones, and the individuals who are doing the news collecting are, of course, as we all know, like friends of ours that are brilliant at it. But there's something about the story that we see and the story that's told when you get back here that it isn't the same. And maybe these images don't count as news, but there's still, I think, value to recording them.
I mean, an image like that, we've all seen photographs of tank and armoured military. We've seen images, a lot of them, but that one, personally, for me, that demands a lot more of my attention. I'm going to spend a lot longer on that image than I might on an image in a paper or on the news. To be honest, that's my point of view. I'm sure other people will understand. So tell us about this one.
This is, again, that famous scene that Ukrainians wanted to sort of tell us so much about, the Russian convoy that was ambushed on its way into Bucha, trying to get close to, well, I think Irpin, actually. And the great story is that they took out the first tank, and then all the others were caught all the way down the street. And they were set fire to, and the trees were burnt and the houses were damaged. And then a few days later, journalists were allowed in, of course, to take photographs of it. And I think, I don't know, it was just a great opportunity for me to try and sit and draw. The rust, like the colour of those tanks is impossible to get in watercolour, practically in paint. The colour that it comes off it once it's burnt at whatever it is, 1,000 degrees, is kind of unforgettable. But I don't know. In a way, these scenes are these are the bits that we imagine war to look like. And if you imagine the Gulf War, it's that cormorant in the oil slick. Do you remember that? And then the fighter jets, and this very clean war that we took to that part of the world. There was no one ever showing any of the huge numbers of civilian deaths. And I think that is the countries that are at war, as we now know, are brilliant at managing the stories and the first thing they do is work out what the PR strategy is. So I'm also subject to all of those rules, but I think the slowness of them, and there's a sort of alternative, as it were, an antidote to that fast pace that perhaps counts for something.
I wonder what your fellow journos make of you when they're clicking away or with their cameras, and you pull out your paper and your.
Great. I'm usually waiting for them. They're usually taking ages, making film and photographs.
Is there a try? I mean, do they respect what you do?
They do, but I can always go in the car with them or without. There's no competition. I'm not taking away. Yeah. There's always a bit of competitiveness between two photographers because they want to take the same image and you can't be in the same picture, so they're always moving out of the way of each other's photographs. But no, I'm obviously no threat because I'm not always taking their space in the newspaper.
There's a series that you made, and they're quite famous, in the metro, in the underground. And those images are astonishing, and
I'll flick to it. And
we'll have been used to. Yeah, there you go. So you discovered this whole world underground, where people are living and creating their own communities. You know, that is the resilience of humankind, that whatever space we're in, we try and figure a way around it. But these pictures are really, really fascinating. So tell us a bit about how you were let into this world.
Someone told me about these. All the metro stations in Kharkiv at the time were being lived in, and I just thought that reminded me so much of those drawings of Belsize Park that Henry Moore did. These sort of dark characters lying on the platforms, and when I got down there, I sort of eventually persuaded them that I should be allowed, because I'm making drawings and not taking photographs, because the people on the door were very protective of the 400 or so people that live on the platform, and the trains were parked up alongside the platforms, and so some people were living in the train, some people just had a spot on the platform, and it was like their entire world was down there. They sometimes went up during the day to check that their house was still okay, bring something back down, but otherwise mattresses, tents, there's some pets in the bottom corner, water bottles. There was a man called Sergey down there, he's in the book, he was 21, a medical student. He had taken over the rubbish room to run a small surgery, and he had a box. He had about 4 boxes, 1 box of antibiotics for the head, 1 for the stomach, 1 for children, and they did a cinema in the evening for the kids. There was an artist making pictures. There wasn't a sort of role that wasn't covered in their world, and just extraordinary life, really. And I guess relevant, particularly this week, because the bombardment of Kharkiv has started again, and the Russian army's come a little bit closer. And I suspect, I don't know if it's true, but this will be a first resort for lots of people, just to be 15 meters underground and to know that at least they're not going to be caught out in the middle of the night by their building being blown up.
What was your overall emotion when you left that scene? What did you think about what you'd been through, what they were going through? What was the impression?
I think I felt that it was the first time perhaps that I could offer something through drawing that it was like one of the subjects that I felt that I could really offer an alternative to. I think some of the other ones are difficult. So it was really just, I mean, in a way, just it felt hopeful and so human, and I think the illustrations are really good at offering like a dignity to the stories that the person's telling you, so yeah, I was really moved that this might still exist in the 21st century, that it could be so obviously cyclical, and yet it's happening right now.
You've described what you do. It's a very interesting thing. You say the drawing is the handshake.
That's actually not my description.
Isn't it?
No,
okay.
That's a Paul Hogarth description.
You've now caught me for you.
You've caught me out on it.
But it's, I absolutely get it.
It's just a fantastic excuse to sit and have a purpose without just being awkward and watching people for no reason. And I made friends with Sergey, this lad, who then came to Cambridge to finish his studies, and I think he's gone back again. But he set me up one night, a little bed on the platform, and by the next morning, I was part of the furniture, and I could
stayed there,
draw whatever I wanted. Yeah. I mean, they're there all the time. I was in there for a night, but it was quite comfortable actually. But you can see in the window the sort of figure of an anonymous sort of sleeping figure.
It's interesting what you choose to colour, and what is your style there, would you say, with your watercolours?
Unfinished?
Yeah.
No, it's supposed to be like that. I think, having studied illustration, there was always an idea of where extra words might go on the page, and sort of space to communicate things. So obviously editorial designers like to have places to put words, but really I think that's one of the great choices of a sort of an artist interpreting something. There is decision to leave out things that may not contribute to the story, or pick out things in colour that I'd like you to look at, so your eye can kind of come across the page. And you can decide for yourself what's...
Has anybody ever said, no, you can't, please don't draw me, or I don't want to speak to you?
Yes, but very rarely. In fact, one of the people in the metro said, in one of the train carriages, said, please, just sort of rolled over and looked the other way and said that we feel like rabbits in a zoo. that was a reaction to the people who'd come through before rather than to me. But so, and then I was also chased. There is almost always a good response. I was chased out of a village in Romania by a man with a horsewhip once. And I was on a bicycle, and he was behind me.
And all you'd done was take the paper out, or
I was sitting and drawing. I think he thought that there was a lot of talk in that part of the world about the beginnings of like fracking for gas there. Nice. So I think he thought I was doing a survey of the village potentially. But no, almost without fail, there's always a real willingness and kindness to share all those stories.
Does anyone have any questions from the floor at all? No? Yeah, we've got a question back there. Yes, you, madam. Oh, the microphone's just coming. Sorry.
First of all, thank you so much. This is really fascinating. Just picking up on what you were saying, do you ever come under suspicion from the authorities? Because as Nina said, it's a bit unusual for a foreigner to be drawing. Have you ever had anything confiscated? Any sort of altercations with intelligence or?
Yeah, I think the answer is yes, but I'm trying to think when. I did a trip from Dushanbe in Tajikistan me and my friend Tim Brown and Joe, we tried to, there's this train line from Dushanbe to Moscow, it's 4 days, and loads of young Tajik men and women use it as their commute to work, and then they get to Moscow and they work for 6 months, send the money back to Tajikistan. And we got as far as Uzbekistan and were sort of just taken off and searched by all these like sort of ex-Soviet spy, like KGB types. And so there is suspicion, but it's sort of unfounded. I mean, it's just convenient to like annoy the journalists every now and again. I think that my job was quite difficult when I was working for Oxfam in the West Bank and Gaza. There's obviously great like limitations about where to go, and permissions are given late in the day, and it's all quite. There's like a pressure there that I think is that makes it kind of easier to understand at the moment. But no, I think by and large they just think that I'm strange, and that why would anyone take you seriously? So you're kind of allowed to stand in the corner for a bit.
Here's to strange. We'll take another question down here at the front.
Thank you, George. Compelling and fascinating as ever. I'm interested in whether you're ever tempted to alter the situation. I'll tell you why I ask that. When you watch natural history programs, sometimes you see these really moving images, for example, of an elephant heading in the wrong direction to the desert to die of thirst. And I always wonder how the camera crew resists giving it water or leading it the right way. You're in a similar situation. Are you ever tempted to contribute, to help, or to promise to send help, for example? You're there to record, I know, but you're also a human being.
Good question.
It's a good question. It's a good question. I think that one of the biggest criticisms of illustration, and perhaps maybe a criticism of myself, is, as you say, that I'm always so biased in favour of the person that's sitting in front of me and telling me their story that I can't. Although I would obviously always double check it and things, but I basically can. The process of drawing them basically means that I find it very difficult not to believe their side of the story. In places like Ukraine at the time, you only had to walk down the street for that to be easy to understand. I have come, often they have been the beginnings of relationships with Syria or with Ukraine, where I've tried to raise money for particular individuals, not military ones, not with a political cause, but like particular individuals who needed something. But the idea, but to go back to your original question about how you interpret a scene, like, does the lamppost need to be a bit further over to the left or right to make it look like a good image? Then that is, I think that's, I think that's allowed. Is it not what you meant?
No.
No, okay. But I think there is an accuracy. I think the drawing for me, the obsession with trying to make a scene accurate and how I found it so that somebody else can see it is like my first and foremost priority.
Because you spend so long with the subject, I'm just wondering if you're doing a drawing of someone and something happens to that person, in that sense that
normally they are busy and they get bored
and it's them
want to go. Yeah.
Okay.
These guys are sitting around when they're waiting for something to happen or having a cigarette. Or this was 2 hours back from the 2-hour flight. They told me to Bakhmut in a place called Poltava, which was actually hit by an artillery round the other day in the news. So fixing helicopters and bits of mechanics, obviously my ideal subject because nobody's going anywhere very quickly. And I was eventually allowed to speak to Anton, who's this 25-year-old helicopter pilot. I wasn't allowed to know his name, I wasn't allowed to know his rank. I could, in fact, ask him about 3 questions in front of his superiors. And he just kept saying, no, I can't answer that question at the moment. And I leave feeling a bit disgruntled. And then about a day later, I get a message on Instagram saying, hi, it's Anton, we spoke yesterday. I've just started an Instagram account so that I can talk to you. Let me know what you want to know. And he took a photograph of the drawing I made, and it's his profile picture on Instagram. And
there you go.
Just sweet, kind sort of interactions. There's a real understanding that they are in the most defining moments of their lives, whether they want to be or not. Lots of them would much rather just not be the heroes that we all think that they are. They don't want to be described as heroes. They just want to get back to life before.
Are you still in touch with Anton?
I am. We don't speak much. He doesn't speak much English, and I don't speak much Ukrainian. But we are. Yeah.
We've got a question here.
On the sort of Ukrainian front, I've heard from, not through media, but through people on meets about the split of families of brothers fighting brothers, and how it used to sort of be a sort of porous border and people went across and everything else. Did you come across stories where families have this terrible dilemma, and you've got, the sort of the grandparents seeing their grandchildren trying to kill each other?
Yes, that's a very regular. Lots of the Ukrainians that I met in Kyiv and elsewhere all have family in Russia. And I think they found it really difficult to reconcile that perhaps their opinions are now completely separate. There's a girl in the book called Lisa who stays up all night working for the space agency, taking photographs from space of Russian positions. And she said that her gran lives in Russia, and that they can no longer speak because her grandmother genuinely thinks that all the Ukrainians are eating babies. That's what she describes them as. And she said that we're not. She's like, my mum doesn't ban me from talking to her, but we've just grown so far apart that there's no way back to try to explain to them that it might not be like that, or that their granddaughter is, who's 26, her mate's a DJ, she's got a conscientious, quite liberal understanding of the world, is not going to sort of push back against the message that's going around Russia at the time. So yeah, I think that's a very real and common experience.
So George, we've got a question from online. Somebody's asking, how did you start doing this in the first place? You mentioned you worked for Oxfam in the West Bank. Was that the beginning of this evolution, this movement into very troubled areas of the world?
It wasn't meant to be troubled, but I did illustration at Kingston, and I think all the people that I admired, like Paul Hogarth and Ronald Searle, Gerald Scarfe, had all done similar trips working as artists for newspapers, and that history is long and fascinating. So originally I had a chance to go to Afghanistan and draw some of the soldiers, British soldiers.
Were you still a student at that point?
I was still a student at that point. And then I did a trip across West Africa, which went on the Times paywall. which was never seen again. It was right at the beginning when nobody knew what a paywall was and nobody wanted to pay for news. And then since then, I've just sought out places that I think illustration could be perhaps a more gentle way of describing what I've found in gold mines in Ghana and leprosy clinics in Nepal and sometimes protests. There's a sort of interesting way of describing them as well. It's not always supposed to be sad, but there's something about creation of an image that I think is really sort of human and good in those vulnerable moments.
Okay, let's take a question over here.
Hi, George. I'm curious about your methodology in these places and your own decisions when you are in Ukraine or Afghanistan. How do you decide you want to draw something in a specific? Which elements attract your attention? And another question is, have you been in a moment where you have told yourself, maybe this wasn't a good idea, I should leave as soon as possible, or I'm just going to do a quick drawing and leave? How do you make these decisions?
Good questions. I think that, I'm trying to remember them all. I think that well, first of all, I think that you're always limited by your ability as an artist, first and foremost. So you're always picking things that you think you can make look good, because we always want like the next picture to be the best one. So you have to kind of fight against that, because otherwise I would spend my entire time drawing tanks or blown up cars. So that's like something to consider. Often the stories are led by what the person's telling me. So in the case of Madame Olga, her story was so moving and so kind of visceral that I felt that it would be impossible not to try and draw her there and then as she spoke. And I think nothing concentrates your mind more quickly than when someone's being, that honesty that you can hear in their voice. I draw much better when I feel the pressure to know that I want to show you what it looks like. And then there are moments when I've walked away from drawing things. I walked into this was in 2012 in Syria. I walked into a hospital where these men were wrapping up the body of an old man who'd been bombed at the hospital by the regime, and they were really keen for me to draw. They were just saying, like, this is what you're here for, why, please start. And for some reason, it just felt too kind of, I felt too much of an imposter to like stand and get out a piece of paper. It just felt so removed from that moment. I have done that since, but at that time, I think it just depends on your reaction to what's happening in front of you. I think if I'd been a photographer, I would have contributed in a different way. I would have probably tried to take photographs that I thought were going to get on the front page, or that image that, career-defining image that we've seen of Don McCullens, but because I was drawing, I didn't really have a choice. I had to be safe to sit down for 40 minutes, and they had to be safe to sit down and talk to me. So that's the way, in a way, that I decide what gets onto the page.
It's interesting some of the spaces you are allowed in. You got into a maternity ward in Afghanistan, didn't you? And you sketched a birth, and in a very conservative country, especially a man going into a ward like that. I mean, I wonder whether it was difficult to persuade people, or were you just welcomed in? I mean, how did that work?
I was with an amazing NGO called Emergency, who are the sort of enormous Italian medical provider. And I spent 3 weeks there in all of their hospitals in Helmand and in Panjshir and in Kabul. And on the first day I drew this body that had been blown up in a Russian explosion, and it had been brought into the hospital. He was called Haji Sabir, and he arrived completely wrapped in bandages from head to toe, and had died before he arrived at the hospital. And that was a very moving, sad moment. I realized that I was the only person in the room who was, for everybody else, it was a very common experience. And then 2 weeks had gone by, and by the end of it, one of the surgeons said, I think we might be able to get you into the maternity ward to make some drawings. And then obviously there's great access to all the people that I never get to meet in the Middle East, which are, of course, women. And suddenly to see them in the sub-NICU ICUs, looking after their babies, and then into the theatre where they were delivering a little boy via caesarean from this lady called Lida, who was 25, into the arms of the sort of Afghan nurses. And yeah, I mean, I was allowed in because I didn't have a camera, but also because, as you know, it just takes time to build up these relationships. And that was a really positive outcome to a sort of very long and difficult trip, that this little boy was alive and well and was going to, well, live another 100 years in Afghanistan, but which is a scary thought.
It's beautiful. We have this question from online asking if there's any one particular story, it's a difficult one, that has stayed with you, or stories that have stayed with you.
Yeah, all of them from the book.
Of course.
Madame Olga, obviously. Yeah. There's a little boy called Vladimir who was 7 when I met him in Kharkiv. He had been caught in a friendly fire incident at a checkpoint, and he had a bullet lodged in his head. And I drew him in his hospital bed about a month later with his family. He was trying to learn to walk again, and the incident that had sort of, where he got shot had also killed his mum, Maria. And so I was in the hospital room with Victor, his brother, and his dad, Stanislav. His uncle and aunt were living downstairs in the basement, so they could be close. And I don't know, that can never not stay with you, I don't think. I went back to see them a year later, and I sort of naively thought that maybe life would have got a little bit better, or maybe there was some hope, or maybe they'd moved house, or but there wasn't really. I think that's what it feels like in Ukraine at the moment. These lives are all sort of stuck in limbo, waiting for something to finish, or they're about to go to university, or are they going to have to sign up, or all those plans that we all have are on hold, and that's, I think, the bit that sticks with you.
Do you think you'll go back?
I would like to go back. I got a lot of messages this week saying, please, yeah, we'd like to buy the books off you. One man called Vladimir, he's in the army, he said, I need to buy 5 books, will you come with you? I said, no, obviously I'll give them to you. And he said, no, I've got a present, you've got to come. And I said, how are you? And he said, I'm fine, I mean, I've got PTSD, but it's absolutely fine. So,
I'm fine, I've got PTSD.
Yeah. I'd love to go back, yeah. I think there needs to be, I mean, maybe I'll just go back with a box of books, but
yeah.
I'd like to do some more work. I'd certainly like to continue recording some of their testimonies.
Just finally, what do you think is the most important thing that you have given, not just the people of Ukraine, but essentially the world, with what's in that book?
Oh my God.
Just a nice, easy one to finish with. In 32 words, please, if you don't mind.
I think that true humanity exists in the most extreme situations, and I don't think that the modern news industry captures enough of it or shares enough of it. And I hope that the book does that through just 24 very ordinary people who wouldn't have made the headlines, but should be remembered.
Well, it's beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful. George, thank you so much. And for everyone who's joined us online, thank you so much, and thank you so much for your questions again. If you are an RSA fellow, you can keep the conversation going on the digital platform platform Circle. So do click on the link that you'll see posted online now, and you'll be taken through to a dedicated chat space to share your thoughts on everything we've been discussing today with members of the Global Fellowship community. Plenty of food for thought. And of course, you'll also find links online to buy Ukraine Remember Also Me with a special event code thanks to our friends at Foyles. Those of you in the room will also be able to get your copy signed by the author himself at the back of the room. So please do stick around for that. So finally, a big thank you to you. Thank you to all our audience. Thank you to the fascinating George Butler.
Thank you, Nina. Great.
Well done. Fascinating.